There are scandals that feel like lightning, a single flash that blinds the world and then disappears into the next headline. And then there are scandals that become weather, permanent, suffocating, hanging over every doorway a person walks through for the rest of her life. Soon, Yi Previn has lived inside that second kind of storm. For decades, her name has been spoken as if it belongs to a courtroom instead of a human being, as if it is a verdict instead of a life. People have argued about her like she was an exhibit. They have argued about him like he was either a genius above morality or a monster protected by fame. And in the middle, the person who actually had to wake up each morning and carry the weight of being stared at, whispered about, reduced to a symbol was her. The video opens on that feeling, the sense that the world never truly let her have a private adulthood. It pulls you back to the moment in 1992 when the secret broke and the public reaction was immediate and brutal. One relationship suddenly redefined an entire family, an entire career, an entire era of celebrity culture. In a matter of days, a complicated domestic arrangement that few outsiders understood was reinterpreted as a simple morality play. The language people used was sharp, absolute, and hungry. It did not ask what her childhood felt like. It did not ask what loneliness sounds like when you are surrounded by people, yet still unseen. It did not ask what it means to grow up adopted and feel as though belonging is conditional, fragile, always at risk. In the retelling, there's an almost cinematic stillness before the impact. A Manhattan apartment, a set of photographs, a discovery that changes the temperature of every conversation afterward. The video describes Mia Farrow's shock as something physical, like the body's refusal to accept what the eyes have already confirmed. And from that instant, the story stops being a private disaster and becomes a global event. Lawyers enter. Cameras circle. Friends become witnesses. Children become evidence. Every sentence spoken inside that family becomes ammunition outside it. The video threads in another accusation from that same period, one that has been publicly contested and fiercely debated for years, and it does so to show how quickly a single household can be swallowed by allegations, denials, and irreversible division. But the hook of this narrative is not only the scandal. It is the promise of a voice that has been missing, or at least muffled by everyone else's interpretation. The video frames Soon Yi as someone who stayed silent not because she had nothing to say, but because speaking meant being devoured. When you speak in a story like this, you do not simply tell your truth. You invite a world that already decided what you are to interrogate you again. You invite strangers to weigh your memories like they are commodities. You invite the same questions, repeated for years, to turn your answers into new accusations. So she disappears into the shadows, and the shadows become part of the mythology. Now the video suggests she is stepping into the light with steadier breath, not to win the argument, but to reclaim the right to define her own life. It hints at pain that predates the scandal, emotional wounds that do not show up in tabloid timelines. It hints at a household that looked artistic and affectionate from the outside, yet felt to her like pressure, strictness, and humiliation. It hints at a young woman who learned early that love can feel like labor, and that being wanted can feel like a privilege rather than a birthright. And against that backdrop, the video presents Woody Allen not as an abstract headline, but as a presence she experienced as attention, listening, and a kind of respect she claimed she had not known before. That is where the unease tightens, because the story becomes less about what the public thinks and more about the psychological logic of survival. When someone feels unseen for long enough, being seen can feel like rescue. When someone feels powerless for long enough, being treated as if her thoughts matter can feel like oxygen. The video asks you to sit in that uncomfortable space, where the world's moral certainty collides with one person's insistence on her own agency, and where the cost of any choice is paid not in theory, but in years of isolation, scrutiny, and permanent labels. What makes this story refuse to fade is not just what happened, but how many boundaries it crossed at the same time. Age, power, loyalty, family, fame, Each one alone would have been enough to spark outrage. Together, they created a scandal so dense that no single explanation could ever contain it. And as the years passed, the public did what it always does in stories like this. It simplified. It chose sides. It demanded clarity where none naturally exists. The video deepens the context by returning to the architecture of the household long before everything collapsed. Woody Allen and Mia Farrow were never a conventional couple, and that unconventionality mattered more than most people realized at the time. They did not marry. They did not live together. They maintained separate apartments, separate routines, and a relationship that floated between intimacy and distance. From the outside, it looked artistic, liberated, modern. From the inside, it created a strange emotional geometry where roles were undefined and boundaries depended on unspoken assumptions rather than rules. For the children, especially the adopted ones, that ambiguity carried weight. Adoption already comes with a quiet question that never fully goes away. Do I belong here unconditionally, or only as long as I fit the shape that is expected of me? The video suggests that for Yi, that question was never resolved. She was not the golden child. She was not the public face of the family. She was the one who worked, who complied, who learned that approval was something earned through obedience rather than given freely. Whether every detail of her account is accepted or contested, the emotional logic it presents is consistent. She grew up feeling peripheral in a family that appeared expansive and loving to the world. When a relationship with Woody Allen began, the public immediately framed it through the lens of power imbalance. A famous director in his 50s, a young woman barely into adulthood. That framing is unavoidable, and the video does not try to erase it. Instead, it complicates it. It insists that power does not flow in only one direction, and that vulnerability can exist in places the audience does not expect. Yi is portrayed not as a naive child seduced by glamour, but as someone desperate to be seen as an adult, someone whose identity had long been defined by what she owed rather than who she was. The discovery of the photographs detonated whatever fragile equilibrium existed. From that moment, every action became performative, every decision amplified by cameras and lawyers. The custody battle that followed is presented not just as a legal conflict, but as a psychological war. Accusations hardened, allegiances split. Children were asked to remember, to testify, to choose. In families, loyalty is rarely clean. It is shaped by fear, gratitude, resentment, and love all at once. The video makes it clear that once the courtroom became the arena, there was no outcome that would not permanently damage everyone involved. Then comes the allegation that changed the moral gravity of the entire story. Dylan Farrow's accusation of abuse transformed the scandal from something disturbing into something unbearable for many observers. At that point, neutrality became impossible. To believe Dylan meant seeing Woody Allen not as controversial, but as criminal. To doubt the allegation meant appearing to side against the child. The investigations, the court findings, the expert testimonies, and the appeals all exist in the background, but the video understands something crucial. Public opinion is not shaped by legal nuance. It is shaped by moral instinct. For Yi, this was the moment when her own voice disappeared almost completely. Any defense of her relationship was immediately interpreted as denial, manipulation, or brainwashing. Any silence was interpreted as proof that she had something to hide. There was no version of her story that could be told without being weaponized. So she withdrew, and that withdrawal became part of the legend, used by others to speak for her. Years later, when she insists that she was not abused, not coerced, and not a victim in the way the public insists on seeing her, the reaction is predictable. Some hear strength. Others hear indoctrination. Some hear autonomy. Others hear the echo of a power dynamic she cannot escape. The video does not pretend to resolve that tension. Instead, it places it at the center, forcing the viewer to confront an uncomfortable truth. Autonomy and vulnerability are not opposites. They often coexist. The marriage in 1997 is framed as a turning point not because it erased the past, but because it locked in a future. Marriage made the relationship durable in a way the public had not expected. It was no longer a scandal that might burn out on its own. It was a life choice renewed every day in the face of judgment. The adoption of children later reinforced that choice, presenting an image of domestic stability that clashed violently with the story the world had already accepted. What the video suggests, without saying it outright, is that the public is often less forgiving of endurance than of collapse. If the relationship had ended quickly, it could have been categorized as a mistake. Because it lasted, it became a provocation. It forced people to confront the possibility that a life can be built on a foundation they find morally unacceptable, and that the people living inside that life may still experience real affection, routine, and meaning. This part of the story does not ask the viewer to absolve anyone. It asks something more unsettling, to acknowledge that human relationships do not always conform to clean, ethical diagrams. That pain does not automatically invalidate love, and that love does not automatically erase harm. And for Yi, telling her story now is not about convincing the world she was right. It is about insisting that she existed and still exists as more than the scandal that froze her at 21 in the public imagination. If you want, I can continue with part 3, 1,000 words, where the narrative moves deeper into psychological power, public judgment, and why this controversy refuses to resolve even after decades. What keeps this story alive after so many years is not the lack of information, but the impossibility of moral closure. Every document has been examined, every quote replayed, every photograph described. And yet the argument never ends, because the story sits at the intersection of two truths that many people cannot hold at the same time. One truth insists that power distorts consent, especially when age, fame, and family proximity are involved. The other insists that a person can still make an authentic choice inside a deeply imperfect context. Yi's voice, when it finally emerges more clearly, forces the audience to sit inside that contradiction instead of escaping it. The video's third movement leans heavily into psychology rather than chronology. It asks not only what happened, but why the same facts provoke such radically different reactions. Why does one viewer see a woman asserting agency, while another sees a victim who cannot recognize her own exploitation? Why does endurance feel like proof to some and like moral provocation to others? The answer lies in how people understand power and how uncomfortable they are with ambiguity. Power is often imagined as something visible and one-directional. Money, status, age, authority. By those measures, Woody Allen clearly possessed power. But the video complicates that picture by introducing emotional power, the kind that grows in environments where affection feels scarce. For someone who grows up feeling unwanted or perpetually judged, attention can become intoxicating. Not because it is manipulative by nature, but because it fills a vacuum. When someone listens without shouting, when someone treats you as if your thoughts matter, it can feel revolutionary. The danger is that this revolution can bind you to the person who offered it, making gratitude and attachment indistinguishable from love. This is where public arguments often collapse into slogans. One side says she chose him. The other says she was groomed. Both statements can coexist without canceling each other out, and that coexistence is exactly what makes people uneasy. Modern culture is deeply uncomfortable with moral gray zones. It prefers villains and victims because those roles offer emotional certainty. Yi's account refuses to stay in either role. The video also explores how memory works under pressure. Trauma does not produce a single, objective narrative. It produces fragments shaped by survival. One child remembers fear. Another remembers protection. One adult remembers control. Another remembers neglect. These memories do not have to be fabricated to be incompatible. They can be honest and still collide. The Farrow family's public fracture illustrates this in painful detail. Siblings who grew up under the same roof now describe entirely different emotional climates, and the world demands to know who is lying. The video quietly suggests a more disturbing possibility, that no one is lying, and that the household itself was fractured in ways that allowed radically different experiences to coexist. When the custody battle and the allegations enter the story, the moral stakes escalate beyond repair. At that point, no personal explanation can neutralize the damage. The courtroom becomes the stage where truth is expected to emerge clean and final. But family courts are not designed to deliver philosophical clarity. They are designed to reduce harm in the present. The rulings, restrictions, and judgments that followed did not heal the family. They formalized its collapse. For Soon Yi, this period marked the end of any illusion that her life could return to anonymity. Her name became a shorthand for controversy. Interviews spoke about her without her. Panel shows debated her psychology without meeting her. Every future action was interpreted through a lens she did not choose. Silence was safer than speech, but silence also allowed others to define her. The video emphasizes how relentless that scrutiny became. Being seen in public meant being stared at. Being photographed meant being analyzed. Even neutral gestures were treated as clues, as if her body language could reveal a hidden truth that words could not. This kind of attention does not simply observe, it disciplines. It teaches a person to shrink, to anticipate judgment, to live defensively. Over time, the self becomes something you protect rather than express. Against that backdrop, the marriage takes on a different meaning. It is not framed as a romantic triumph, but as an act of defiance against erasure. By marrying, she refused to be a temporary scandal. She chose permanence in a world that wanted collapse. That choice angered many people more than the original revelation. Society is often more comfortable with transgression followed by punishment than with transgression followed by endurance. Punishment confirms the moral order. Endurance challenges it. The adoption of children later intensifies this challenge. Parenthood is culturally associated with responsibility, care, and normalcy. For critics, this feels like an insult, as if the past has been brushed aside. For defenders, it feels like proof of growth and stability. The video does not resolve this tension. It simply presents the reality that life continued, regardless of public approval. The resurgence of the scandal during the Me Too era illustrates how cultural context reshapes interpretation. Allegations that once existed at the margins moved to the center. Public patience for ambiguity shrank. For many, the case became symbolic, no longer about specific individuals, but about patterns of abuse and the historical protection of powerful men. In that climate, Soon Yi's insistence on her own narrative felt almost unacceptable. To some, her words threatened the broader project of believing victims. To others, silencing her threatened the very idea of personal agency. This is the trap the video keeps returning to. If you believe her, are you undermining other victims? If you doubt her, are you denying her humanity? The story forces viewers to confront how easily moral causes can flatten individual lives. It also exposes how quickly empathy becomes conditional, offered only when a person's story aligns with what we want to hear. Perhaps the most unsettling insight in this part of the narrative is that resolution may never come, not because the truth is unknowable, but because the truth is plural. Multiple realities existed inside that family, and the collision of those realities destroyed any shared language they might have used to heal. The public stepped into that vacuum and built its own mythology, one that continues to feed on outrage and certainty. In the end, the video suggests that Soon Yi's admission is not a confession or a defense. It is an assertion of existence. She is not asking to be forgiven, nor is she asking to be believed by everyone. She is insisting that her life cannot be reduced to a single moral lesson. That insistence is what keeps the story uncomfortable, unresolved, and alive. By the time the story reaches this stage, it is no longer really about what happened in the early 1990s. It is about what happens afterward, when a life must be lived under a permanent label. Scandals usually burn fast and then fade, but this one hardened into identity. For Soon Yi, the past did not recede into memory. It followed her into adulthood, marriage, motherhood, and middle age, shaping how strangers saw her before they ever heard her speak. The video's fourth movement focuses on this endurance under stigma. It shows how public judgment does not simply punish once. It repeats itself endlessly. Every appearance, every mention, every interview becomes a reopening of the case. Time, which normally softens outrage, seems to sharpen it here. New generations encounter the story not as history, but as a moral test they feel compelled to pass. And each retelling strips away more nuance in favor of sharper positions. What is striking is how the world demands performance from those it judges. If Suni appears calm, she is accused of being cold. If she appears emotional, she is accused of manipulation. If she stays silent, she is accused of hiding. If she speaks, she is accused of rewriting history. There is no posture that satisfies an audience that has already decided what she represents. She is not allowed to simply be a person living a life. She must constantly symbolize something larger than herself. The video emphasizes that this pressure did not end with marriage. If anything, marriage intensified it. A long-lasting relationship challenges the public desire for moral resolution. People often expect controversial relationships to self-destruct, confirming the belief that they were wrong from the start. When that destruction does not happen, discomfort turns into resentment. Stability becomes suspicious. Longevity becomes an affront. Motherhood adds another layer to that resentment. Society treats parenthood as a moral credential. When someone deemed morally compromised steps into that role, it triggers anxiety and anger. The video suggests that the adoption of children was interpreted by critics not as care, but as provocation. It forced the public to confront a reality it did not want to accept, that a family can function quietly even when its origin story is publicly condemned. The persistence of judgment reveals something unsettling about collective morality. Outrage is often less about protecting principles and more about maintaining a shared sense of order. When individuals live visibly outside that order without collapsing, they threaten the illusion that morality is enforced naturally. The world responds by tightening scrutiny, repeating accusations, and refusing closure. The video also explores how narratives solidify over time. Once a story becomes iconic, it resists revision. New details are filtered through old conclusions. Even when someone involved speaks in their own voice, that voice is measured against a script written decades earlier. Any deviation from the script is treated as deception. This is why Soon Yi's later interviews feel less like revelations and more like confrontations with an audience that does not want to be convinced. There's a deeper question running beneath this. Who owns a story once it becomes public? The family lived it, but the world consumed it. Media retellings transformed pain into content. Opinions hardened into identity markers. Supporting or condemning the relationship became a way for people to signal their values. In that process, the individuals at the center were flattened into symbols. The video does not ask the viewer to abandon moral judgment. Instead, it asks whether judgment can coexist with humility. Can we acknowledge the discomfort and still accept that we may never fully understand what it was like to live inside that family? Can we hold space for multiple truths without demanding a single moral winner? Soon Yi's endurance suggests a quiet refusal to be erased by other people's certainty. She does not claim that the past was painless or that the controversy was imaginary. She claims that her life continued anyway. That continuation is not triumphant. It is stubborn. It is the daily work of living under a gaze that never blinks. In the final tone of this part, the video reframes the question entirely. Instead of asking whether the relationship should have existed, it asks what it costs a person to exist forever inside a controversy. What happens when your youth, is frozen in scandal, when your adulthood is measured against a single decision, and when forgiveness is something the public discusses without ever granting. The story remains unresolved not because evidence is missing, but because resolution would require accepting complexity. It would require admitting that people can make choices shaped by pain, that those choices can lead to real attachment, and that real attachment does not retroactively simplify the past. It would also require accepting that moral outrage, once unleashed, rarely knows when to stop. This part leaves the viewer with an uncomfortable realization. Some stories never end because society needs them not to end. They become reference points, cautionary tales, and battlegrounds for values. And the people who live inside them carry that weight long after the audience has moved on to the next debate. The story of Yi Previn and Woody Allen moves into its fifth chapter by focusing on the nature of truth and how public perception warps personal reality. By now, the audience has followed decades of scandal, courtroom battles, media scrutiny, and family fracture. But the video emphasizes that the most difficult battles are not legal or social. They are internal. For Soon, truth has never been a matter of proving innocence or guilt to others. It has been about asserting her own experience in a world that refuses to let her define herself. The narrative begins by revisiting the early emotional landscape of her life. Mia Farrow's household, the video recounts, was demanding and exacting, creating an environment where love and discipline were inseparable from fear and obedience. Soon describes endless chores, harsh criticism, and public embarrassment. These experiences were formative, and the video suggests they shaped her perception of what constitutes attention and care. When someone finally treated her as an autonomous adult, listened to her, recognized her worth, it felt revolutionary. In this context, the relationship with Allen is framed not as manipulation, but as a response to decades of marginalization and invisibility. The video stresses that autonomy and vulnerability can coexist, complicating any attempt to assign a simple moral label. The next focus is the public's relentless reinterpretation of events. The video illustrates how each interview, each appearance, each mention of Soon in the media became a new iteration of the scandal. Her silence was taken as guilt, her speech as defense of a wrong. Every personal choice, moving into her own apartment, attending an event, marrying, was scrutinized as a confirmation of wrongdoing or audacity. Here, the story shifts from personal narrative to social observation, revealing the mechanics of ongoing stigma. Scandals, especially those involving morality and family, rarely conclude. They linger as cultural artifacts, defining public attitudes and reshaping memory itself. The narrative then examines the persistence of judgment through the lens of marriage and family. Allen and Soon-Yi's marriage in Venice in 1997 is portrayed not merely as an act of love, but as a declaration of defiance. In marrying, Soon-Yi asserted that her life could not be dictated solely by public outrage. She embraced a private reality in which her choices mattered, independent of the world's verdict. Adoption of children further reinforced this assertion, signaling the creation of a family unit that could operate according to its own values. The video highlights the paradox. Public perception, which expected collapse or punishment, was confronted instead with endurance. Stability, often assumed to be validation, here becomes a challenge to moral expectations. By tracing the Me Too era's revival of scrutiny, the video situates the story within a broader cultural conversation. Past allegations and scandals were reframed, and societal standards evolved. People who once accepted ambiguity now demanded clear moral judgment. The narrative explores the tension between societal oversight and personal agency. The public expects protection for the vulnerable, but struggles to accept that adults can exercise choice even when those choices are controversial. Soon-Yi's insistence that the relationship was consensual and adult becomes a locus of both defiance and discomfort. The video points out the cognitive dissonance. Autonomy exists, but the context remains morally fraught. Audience discomfort is not alleviated by clarity because complexity itself threatens preconceived ethical schemas. The next layer addresses competing memories within the Farrow family. Moses Farrow defends Soon, E, and Alan, emphasizing control and fear under Mia Farrow. Dylan Farrow and others maintain a narrative of abuse and protection. The video presents these conflicts without prioritizing one account, illustrating that truth within families is rarely singular. Perceptions differ, and memory is filtered through experience and survival mechanisms. The lesson is unsettling. The public wants certainty, but lived reality often refuses it. Family truths are plural, contradictory, and enduring. The narrative underscores that courts and media, while authoritative, cannot fully reconcile these divergent experiences. Legal rulings provide resolution for custody, visitation, and property, but they do not settle memory, emotion, or the moral imagination of observers. The video also examines how Soon-E manages ongoing scrutiny while building a life. Privacy becomes a form of resistance. Public appearances are deliberate and selective. Daily life, however ordinary it might seem, carries the weight of years of observation. Her voice, when permitted, is measured but persistent. She acknowledges that the world will always have its judgment, but she refuses to be defined solely by it. This persistence underscores a theme of endurance. Personal narrative is a form of agency, even when contested externally. The video contrasts this with cultural obsession. Society often treats enduring stability as evidence of moral compromise, revealing a collective discomfort with unpunished continuity. Another focus is the intersection of love and trauma. The video suggests that emotional attachment formed under complicated circumstances cannot easily be separated from ethical critique. Critics see power imbalance and public disapproval. Insiders see care, attention, and mutual recognition. The story resists easy classification, illustrating how affection and controversy can coexist. This duality is central to understanding both the personal and public dimensions of the narrative. Love is present, but so is judgment. Happiness exists, but so does trauma. Choice is exercised, but within a context the world constantly scrutinizes. Toward the conclusion of Part 5, the video emphasizes the psychological labor involved in living with permanent scandal. Every social interaction, every mention in media, every public perception carries historical weight. For Soon-E, simply existing as an adult who has made her own choices requires constant navigation of others' interpretations. This endurance is framed as courage, but also as necessity. To refuse to shrink under perpetual scrutiny is both protective and affirming. Finally, the video returns to the broader cultural implications. The narrative illustrates how society consumes personal stories as morality tales, often at the expense of the individuals involved. It questions the ethical framework of public discourse. Can observers distinguish between empathy and judgment? Can a person maintain autonomy while the world insists on labeling them? The video leaves these questions unresolved, emphasizing that some controversies persist not because evidence is lacking, but because the public demands they persist. Soon-Yi's story, as presented here, becomes both a case study in endurance and a meditation on the impossibility of absolute moral clarity. The story of Yi Previn and Woody Allen in its sixth chapter shift from scandal to the subtler, long-term pressures of living under perpetual public scrutiny. By this point, decades have passed since the initial revelations, and the video emphasizes that the most relentless challenges are no longer legal or social, but psychological. Even as the couple builds a private life, the shadow of public judgment stretches across every decision, every interaction, and every appearance. The audience is reminded that in cases like this, time does not heal the public memory. It preserves it, sometimes with added intensity, as newer generations encounter the scandal as a moral litmus test rather than historical fact. The narrative explores how the enduring gaze of the public shapes behavior. Sun Yi's daily existence is described as a careful negotiation between autonomy and exposure. Social interactions are no longer neutral. They are interpreted through decades of accumulated judgment. Simple actions, attending an art event, walking through a city street, or even posting a photograph, carry a legacy of scrutiny. The video highlights that her life, which could have been ordinary, remains exceptional only because it is observed and evaluated constantly. The ordinary becomes extraordinary, not by its inherent nature, but by the unending projection of others' expectations. One of the central points of this segment is the psychological cost of being perpetually observed. Constantly navigating others' perceptions creates a form of hypervigilance. The video illustrates that for Sun Yi, this means measuring every gesture, anticipating every judgment, and protecting personal and familial boundaries with relentless care. Even minor errors or unintended appearances could be misinterpreted as moral or ethical lapses. This continuous management of perception becomes a labor that few can imagine but all must recognize as exhausting. It shapes personality, social behavior, and even emotional availability. The video also examines the ways in which public scrutiny intersects with family and community relationships. The Farrow household's division, the court battles, and the ongoing allegations contribute to a fragmented social environment. Siblings and relatives offer conflicting narratives, each positioning themselves morally. In such a climate, family bonds are tested repeatedly, and alliances are constantly recalibrated. The audience is reminded that public perception does not respect internal nuance. It often selects the most sensational narrative and amplifies it. Consequently, the family dynamic is forever intertwined with media framing, creating tension that affects each individual differently. Sun Yi's marital life is portrayed as a site of both refuge and continued challenge. While the relationship with Alan provides emotional stability, care, and mutual recognition, it also exists in constant juxtaposition with a world that questions its legitimacy. The video emphasizes that happiness under such conditions is never uncomplicated. It requires ongoing negotiation between private fulfillment and public skepticism. The couple's choice to maintain discretion in public life is a strategic adaptation designed to minimize exposure while preserving autonomy. Yet even discretion cannot fully shield them from rumor, critique, or the moral expectations imposed by society. The segment explores how media culture perpetuates scandal as entertainment, transforming lived experience in a narrative commodity. In this environment, every public detail is scrutinized for moral or symbolic significance, often divorced from personal truth. The video contrasts this with the private reality of the couple's life, showing that the media's persistent framing does not always reflect the texture, routine, and care that define their daily existence. This tension between representation and reality underscores a core theme. Living under the persistent eye of judgment changes not only how others perceive a person, but how that person perceives themselves. Another focus is the interplay between agency and moral expectation. Sun Yi's continued affirmation that the relationship was consensual and adult-centered challenges the audience's need for closure. The video points out that personal choice and public morality are often at odds. Society's moral instinct demands definitive verdicts, whereas individual experience is always more nuanced. By asserting her agency, she refuses to be entirely defined by the scandal. Yet in doing so, she confronts a world that is unwilling to accept complexity. The tension between self-definition and societal expectation becomes a defining feature of her narrative. The narrative further examines how enduring scandal affects identity formation. Years of scrutiny, public interpretation, and conflicting family testimonies create an environment in which personal history is continuously rewritten by others. For Sun Yi, maintaining a coherent sense of self requires resisting external definitions while simultaneously navigating the reality that every aspect of her life may be interpreted as evidence for or against her character. The video suggests that this dual consciousness, living authentically while managing others' narratives, is an ongoing challenge that shapes every aspect of her social, emotional, and familial life. Finally, the video situates the story within broader cultural patterns. Public fascination with celebrity scandal reflects deeper societal desires. The need to enforce moral norms, the desire to witness power checked, and the compulsion to resolve ambiguity. Yet this cultural mechanism often overlooks the human cost. Individuals like Soon-Yi must negotiate their lives not only in private, but under an unrelenting public gaze that simultaneously scrutinizes, judges, and resists reconciliation. The video frames this endurance as both remarkable and necessary, a testament to personal resilience in a world that values spectacle over nuance. Part 6 concludes by emphasizing that the relationship between scrutiny and stability is ongoing. Even decades after the initial revelations, living under continuous observation reshapes behavior, thought, and identity. The video presents this not as a lament, but as an observation. The human capacity to adapt to relentless external judgment is profound, yet never without cost. Soon-Yi's life exemplifies both the possibility and the difficulty of asserting personal truth in a world committed to narrative closure. In the next chapter, the story will explore how public perception continues to shape private existence and the enduring interplay between fame, morality, and personal autonomy. Part 7 of Yi Previn's story shifts focus toward legacy, public memory, and the ongoing negotiation between private life and societal scrutiny. By now, decades have passed since the original scandal. The video emphasizes that the life of a person at the center of such a controversy is never entirely private. Each decision, each public appearance, and even each silence continues to be interpreted through the lens of past events. The story explores how identity, reputation, and personal truth intersect when the world has already written a narrative about you. The narrative begins by highlighting the enduring nature of public memory. Unlike ordinary events that fade, scandals with moral and celebrity dimensions persist indefinitely. Every article, video, and retrospective revisits the story, often simplifying complexity into moral binaries. The video shows how Soon-Yi's life, though lived largely outside the spotlight, is constantly reframed for audiences who demand closure and clarity. Even decades later, she is not treated simply as an individual, but as a symbol of a controversial relationship and a family fractured in the public eye. Marriage, parenthood, and domestic stability are explored as sites of resistance and personal assertion. Soon-Yi and Alan's life together is depicted as an ongoing act of choosing continuity despite scrutiny. Their commitment, the video argues, challenges cultural expectations that morally charged relationships must end in collapse. This endurance reframes scandal, showing that long-term stability does not always equate to moral approval, but reflects resilience, negotiation, and an exercise of agency. The narrative emphasizes that their life is a deliberate negotiation between private fulfillment and public judgment, a balancing act maintained across decades. The video then examines the interplay between agency, autonomy, and moral perception. Soon-Yi asserts repeatedly that the relationship was entered voluntarily and that she was fully an adult. This insistence on personal agency is central, yet it is presented alongside the recognition that society often resists complexity. Audiences want narratives of clear wrongdoing or unequivocal victimhood, and a story that resists categorization is inherently uncomfortable. By framing her truth this way, the narrative illuminates the tension between living authentically and meeting external moral expectations. Her endurance and assertion of autonomy become acts of quiet defiance against a public that would prefer to freeze her in the role of scandal victim. Next, the video turns to family dynamics and memory. The Farrow household remains central to understanding the story's complexity. Competing narratives from different siblings, Moses supporting Alan and soon E, Dylan and others supporting Mia, highlight how memory and experience are subjective. The video suggests that multiple truths can coexist in a single family, each colored by perspective, personality, and emotional stakes. The public, however, often seeks a singular truth, imposing a moral verdict that may not reflect lived reality. This tension between private plurality and public expectation shapes the ongoing narrative and underscores the difficulty of reconciling individual experiences with collective judgment. Public scrutiny is presented as a persistent force. Even after decades, media coverage, cultural discussion, and moral debates continually revisit the scandal. The video emphasizes the psychological labor involved in navigating this environment. Constant awareness, careful management of appearance, and the anticipation of judgment in every action. This vigilance shapes social behavior, emotional expression, and personal decisions. Living under perpetual observation is depicted not as optional, but as a necessary adaptation, a form of survival that enables personal life to continue amid relentless public gaze. The story also considers the impact of cultural movements, particularly Me Too, on the perception of past events. Allegations that were once debated under different social norms are now interpreted through new ethical frameworks. The video highlights how this shift recontextualizes the story, reminding viewers that private choices are often judged retroactively, shaped by evolving societal values. Soon Yi's insistence on her autonomy and adult consent is met with renewed controversy, illustrating the enduring friction between personal truth and public morality. The narrative examines how enduring scandal influences identity formation. When a person's life is constantly interpreted and reinterpreted by outsiders, personal history becomes a contested space. Soon Yi's identity is shaped both by her lived experience and by how that experience is consumed and narrated by others. The video underscores the complexity of maintaining a coherent self-concept under continuous public scrutiny. It is not merely about defending choices. It is about asserting a right to personal narrative in the face of a culture that thrives on simplification, sensationalism, and moral judgment. Finally, the video situates Soon Yi's story within broader reflections on legacy and endurance. Her life demonstrates that personal truth and public perception often diverge. The narrative emphasizes that love, autonomy, and family stability can coexist with controversy and judgment. It concludes by suggesting that the ultimate legacy is not determined by public opinion or historical narrative, but by the ongoing capacity to live authentically and to assert personal truth, even when the world refuses to accept it. This final reflection frames the story as a meditation on resilience, the complexity of human relationships, and the possibility of finding peace despite enduring scrutiny. In the closing moments, the video reiterates a key insight. Scandals do not simply fade. They persist in cultural memory, shaping perceptions long after the events themselves. Yet, individuals like Soon Yi Previn demonstrate that it is possible to navigate this persistence, building a life that honors personal truth while surviving external judgment. Endurance, discretion, and autonomy become acts of quiet resistance, revealing the human capacity to reclaim narrative control in a world that continually seeks to define one's story. The video closes on this note, leaving viewers to reflect on the interplay between morality, agency, and the resilience required to maintain one's life under unrelenting public scrutiny.